Hey, Shemai, what's up everyone? This is Benjamin, and today I'm asking you, what made Wales one nation? We had so many early kingdoms in the early days, like Gwynedd, Dyfed, Gwent, Powys, Sechwg, Brycheiniog, smaller ones like Gwertherion, Gwir, Clywysyn. You get the idea. How on earth did all these competing kingdoms ros? I like that one. How did all these competing kingdoms come together, or when they were separate, call themselves one people? That's what this video is about today. The name for Wales, Cymru, comes from Cymru, obviously, but what does that mean? It's an amazing root, I love it. It's fusing Latin with British. So what do I mean? You have the com bit, which is like in compatriot, communion, that Latin meaning together, and that was already in the old British language. It had already brought in Latin influences centuries before Welsh emerged. And then the mri bit, that's from brogi, the plural, peoples or regions, regions. There was no differentiation between people and land in this early period. So together, peoples of our land, our fellow countrymen, compatriots, and it's so important that we understand even the name of our country is a fusion between Latin and British. We, from our very conception, are Romano-British. That's what you have to know first. We had a distinct cultural fusion going on as we were growing, as all these new kingdoms emerged here in Wales. So I've broken down three things that really formed us as a singular nation despite this massively pluralistic base. And surprisingly, the land is not really one of them, but it is. I'll explain in the third one, but just for now, the land of Wales is so broken and divided, valleys cut and shut off from each other. How could we possibly form a united nation in this? So it wasn't the land that united us. The land actually divided us quite severely and to our detriment later on. One could argue even today. I mean, try getting a train from Conwy to Abertawe. You have to go through England. I mean, that's just nonsense. So what are these three things that really pressed us together and unified us as a nation, even though we were still quite split apart? So the first one is actually religion. Crefydd. What do I mean by this? Cymru, Wales, is entirely unique on these islands in the fact that when it emerges in written records onto the stage, there's no written record of us converting to Christianity. When that comes in, Wales is already a Christian nation. That's not the case for England, Ireland, Scotland. Okay, Cornwall is a bit like us, but that's because they're a bit like us. But the other major nations that you would expect on these islands, they were pagan. We were surrounded by pagans. And the only connection we had to other Christian cultures was by this Western Sea route. That's key. And so many of our saints gave names to our islands. Ynys Serio. Here, Serio was a saint. Ynys Gybi. Here. And Gybi was actually from Cornwall. That's important. This sea route between us. Cornwall and Brittany was what was uniting us, keeping us in relation to each other, remembering that we are a people. And as we were shut off along the east, that memory was producing in us the concept that we are a nation of distinction of our own. Unas beer here. And you'll notice that beer comes from peer and gubby from cubby. Why does that letter change? Because when the language was forming, we still had the remnants of a case system, like you have in Irish or Lithuanian or Latin, right? And so our most holiest see is not named T. Dewi, the house of Dewi Sant, but to Dewi. There's a mutation there, because it's showing that it belongs to him. That grammatical case of ownership changes the letters, and that's how we can tell certainly that these are from a monastic age. And I cannot stress how important Dewi Sant, St. David, is. Because even in these early times, he began to amass such a cult behind and around him. He became a national force, used in our poetry as a propaganda tool. Clearly, within the next few hundred years, this religious fervor propelled our national fervor. Hermits, seeking remote places to gain closeness with their God. But yet, these ecclesiastical places are not far up into the mountains. They're all, almost without exception, close and huddled in valleys or close to the coast. We are not, contrary to popular belief, a people of the mountain. We are a people of the valleys. All our early ecclesiastical centers of power grew up in these flatter lands, with the exception of Llangurig here. We were not a people retreating to the romanticized isolation of the mountains. We were extending out into the fertile lands and the fertile minds, planting Christianity in them. And it's in these flat, fertile bits between the mountains that we grow as a people, and we get classi, monastic communities growing, like Llanilltyd Fawr, Bangoris Coed, where there was a massacre later on. Though there was variation in these ecclesiastical styles within our country, the great majority of these classi were in the southeast, where the Roman presence held on much longer. Along Dyfr and Gwy, the valley of the River Gwy, there are loads of these, far more than anywhere else in any one place in Wales. You get a few in Morgannwg, but going west they're much more scattered and much more even across Wales. And you get this name, Llan, a religious enclosure. And because these are so prominent in this period, we can say that in the 5th century especially, when these were being populated, this was a national, a Wales-wide phenomenon. And this is not just in Wales. You see elements of this in Cornwall and Brittany. St. Samson, from a noble family in Dyfed. That's quite a theme, that aristocratic nobility became saints. He went to Ynys Beer for that Saint Pier to learn from him. He found it not to his liking and went to live in a cave along Afon Havre, and even that was too much for him, so he took the seaways down to Brittany and became the patron saint of Dole. And so we were communicating with each other in a sphere that was very different from the other nations around us, Ireland, Scotland, England. We were communicating within a Christian world, and they were not. And that difference between us may in truth have preserved our language. When Rome was basically asking us to convert these Saxons, we refused, because the relations between us were not cordial. They had taken our inheritance from us. We were keenly aware of that. And as differences emerged in the church over the date of Easter, the Synod of Whitby in 664, the newly converted Northumbrians went over to the Roman rites. Most other Celtic churches submitted to Rome in the course of the 7th century. Not until 768, a century later, did a Bishop of Bangor secure the agreement of the Welsh Church to the Roman Easter, and most of its distinctive practices it retained to the death. Only when the Normans came in the 11th century, the Normans wanted to erase our ecclesiastical distinction from the earth. They hated it viscerally when they came in the 11th century because they understood it proved our distinction centuries before they even existed, that we were a nation. And this is why this part of this video has been longer. What distinguished us as a nation first and foremost, it was our ecclesiastical presence and building structures which we adhered to within our own hierarchy, saying to other nations, this is how we do things here, not how you do things there. It is impossible to deny that our language helped shape us as being distinct and unified as a nation, because when these kingdoms came together, of course, you would be aware that they spoke the same language as you. But there's an interesting fact across the spectrum of these Brythonic languages, Welsh, Cornish, Breton, is that in the far north of our spectrum, around Glasgow, in Scotland today, they were calling themselves Cambrogi. They added a B in. But in the south, Cornwall and Brittany did not. They were saying themselves to be Britons, British. We did too, but they didn't add that Cymru bit. So we can safely say that we were very closely related nations, but that Cornwall and Brittany were kind of one nation, and that us, along all through North England and southern Scotland, another nation. And so we were aware, going up to the Pennines and up around to Glasgow, we were one thing. And speaking of the language, the fact that Welsh itself was still forming in this period, and the poetry that we have that's passed down or rewritten, copied from this period, it shows we are playing with words, learning how it works, learning how it alliterates and rhymes, what goes naturally into what. We're playing with a new form. This language in the 5th and 6th century still feels new, radically so. We're developing this in our poetry, and this poetry is being read in different royal courts, from Caerhedon, Edinburgh, all the way down to Dinbych Episcod and Dyfed. We're aware that we have this common medium between us. And this wouldn't necessarily make us as aware that we are a nation, but it did because of the Saxons coming in and forcing us to be more keenly aware of our language. The Anglo-Saxons in many cases clearly held our language in contempt and open hatred of its existence. They hated the fact that we are the British. They resented it. It even formed the embryonic forms of English identity itself. And we would have clearly been aware of this hatred towards us. And for them to unify us in their psychology as a singular foe of a type would have caused us to see ourselves as a nation, because it was the English, or those becoming English, who were seeing us as a nation. And they even encodified this in Anglo-Saxon laws, classifying us as a specific group. And we, traversing back and forth, would have become keenly aware of how we were seen, which would begin to change how we saw ourselves through our language. The third thing that really shaped and forced us into being a nation as one people, despite all these many kingdoms, is the fact that Mercia arose. And Northumbria to a lesser extent in the north. But Mercia really formed a wall between Chester and Morhavran, the Severn Sea, the Severn Estuary. Is that how you say it? And this meant we couldn't expand without going to war against Mercia, which we often did. to our detriment in most cases, but we did win a few, come on. This meant that we were forced behind later on this dike in the late 8th century, which forced us this strange, oblong, jagged, mountainous scape of two incompatible peninsulas, that is, Cymru, forced that together into a geographical unification that makes no sense. But we had no choice. We had to make something of it because those around us left us with no choice. And so the kings immediately after this age, Rhodri Fawr, they certainly begin calling this Cymru and us Cymru. And in this age, those two words had no distinction. And that is how you know that there was a unification of mind. We thought of ourselves as belonging to this land together. Despite our clear and often hostile political differences with each other, we knew that to the east lay something else that was clearly not our culture, our language, and at this point still our faith. Many of them in England were not Christians, and even when they did, our church was separate with a different tradition. We had rituals and rites which were apart. This brought us into conflict on many occasions, which furthered the divide between us and the Saxons. But being together, we had to come up with a legal system to work with each other to avoid endless civil war. And just after this period, after we've called ourselves Cymru, fusing Latin and British, after the faith has come in and changed us beyond recognition with our pagan surroundings, after the language has formed clearly from British into Welsh, and then later when Mercia comes and puts that fierce wall between us, just after this, a king emerges named Hywel, and he says, "We are Welsh. This is Wales. We need a series of laws to relate to each other so that we're not constantly at war with each other." And that legal system can only happen when you already identify as a nation. And that's what we come to in the next episode. It's great you made it this far, and for those of you who are my Patreons, thank you for your contribution. If you'd like to join me, I'll put a link below, and you can help get this channel going strong.